Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to Network Partners' Brunch and Learn, how to expertly choose a global labeling system with our Senior Director of Labeling, Chris Heckert. A few quick housekeeping items. We ask that you mute yourselves upon entry. Note a colleague will actively monitor and manually mute participants as and if needed. Next, please address all questions through the chat feature of the platform. If you quickly move your mouse around a little bit, you should see a little bar that pops up, and then you'll see a little chat box that says show conversation. Click that, and then that's where you can go ahead and insert any of your comments or questions. We'll answer these questions at the end of the presentation. Lastly, this webinar will be recorded, and you'll receive the recorded presentation as well as the PDF version of the PowerPoint. So without further ado, Network Partners' Senior Director of Labeling, Chris Heckert.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're listening from. I'm going to talk about choosing a global labeling system or a global enterprise labeling system very enthusiastically for the next 30 minutes. I'm going to be on this slide for a little while, so don't worry that the slides aren't advancing just yet. I also have some screenshots in the presentation that I pulled off the internet. I'm not even quite sure after moving them around. I don't know which companies they're from. This is not an endorsement for any particular solution provider, just the best way to choose a global labeling system. My goal is to give you a map to a place where you and your team will be sitting in a conference room trying to make a decision between two solution providers who both meet your well thought out requirements for a global enterprise labeling system, or as I will refer to it out of habit, a GLS. So the question is, why do you even want a GLS? Do you want to update and approve 1,000 labels in one day? Do you want to drive field actions due to labeling down to 0? Do you want to be able to respond immediately to country-specific labeling requirements? Do you want to stop controlling your label specifications with engineering drawings? Do you want to stop controlling your label content with bills of material? Do you want to make your label approval process a breeze? Do you want to control your contract manufacturers by allowing them to print labels that you create and approve? Do you want to eliminate pre-printing IFUs for low-volume markets by printing single-language IFUs at the time of final shipping? When you decide to pursue a GLS, where do you start? What do you have to do to get your company ready for it? What kind of plan, what kind of expectation should you have? This webinar will touch on the various aspects of choosing a GLS, from prepping your process to guidelines on how to populate your user requirement specification. If you've heard me talk about global labeling systems before, you know I get really excited for people that are exploring this path. But you don't start the process by buying the GLS. A global labeling system is just part of your total overall labeling strategy. In an earlier webinar, which is available on our website, we laid out the foundation for a successful labeling process. First, you have to identify what you intend to accomplish with your labeling. Our suggestion for most clients whose products are sold by prescription only is to meet regulatory requirements. Nothing more. You've got to understand what elements are required for your product's label and which department is responsible for those elements, and then document these decisions. Standardize and streamline the intake of this content in a procedure that gets all the label content to a labeling department, which then formats this content in a labeling system. Set appropriate approvals, and the labeling group will enable and transfer the label to production when approval is achieved. Production will then use this system to print labels in the production and distribution environment throughout the life cycle of the label. Again, this sounds simple on a webinar. For all you vice presidents and senior directors listening in, of which I don't think we have any, labeling should be this simple, but your current labeling process is not simple. In fact, it may be a mess. Your initial labeling process was set up when you had 2 families of products. You're 25 times larger than that now, and half of that came from an acquisition with its own labeling process. Throw in UDI, throw in EU MDR, throw in the seeming monthly new requirement for country-specific labeling, and there's a good chance that your labels are correct in finding their way onto product through the sheer will of a few overworked and underappreciated people in your labeling department. You need a global labeling system, but you've got to make sure you've got a solid process that will support and feed your system. The first step to choosing a global labeling system is to engage the stakeholders. I know you're ready to get a list of system requirements, but to be realistic, we need to be honest about how hard it is to get to the choosing part of a global labeling solution. Decision. You will need upper management support to get a GLS. First, they cost a lot of money, so you'll need to get a systems cost into next year or the following year's budget. Secondly, you'll need to rouse a large number of people across a wide range of departments to get the process started. Here's your first list of tasks. Get a sponsor with clout. The more clout, the better. Get some advocates. These are people who don't need to be sold on the fact that your current labeling system is playing defense against your company. Share your story. Labeling people tend towards demur. Go ahead and let people know that they would get their country-specific label sooner if you had a better system. Gain agreement to conduct an assessment of your current labeling process. This assessment is imperative. Well, I'm aware of a couple companies that have purchased a global labeling system without conducting a comprehensive assessment. I'm aware of them because they've contacted us to fix their systems. They bought a GLS and it's underperforming. They bought the flashy performance version when they needed the minivan version, and then were disappointed when they discovered their system can't haul the groceries because it doesn't have a trunk, and they blame the system, not the selection process. So the assessment will help you define your requirements. Your assessment will identify your pain points. Some of these pain points will be alleviated by fixing the first three pillars of your labeling process: identification of your labeling elements, roles and responsibilities, and standardization of your procedures. These process improvements will eliminate a lot of the pain points you identify in your assessment. The remaining pain points are the drivers for getting your global labeling system. You don't need to wait until the first three parts of your process are actually changed to begin taking steps to acquire a global labeling system. As a matter of fact, we have a current client that just conducted their final selection demonstrations for their global labeling systems. We first engaged with them 2.5 years ago. After we had conducted a very thorough assessment and socialized that assessment throughout the organization, they decided they were going to buy a new global labeling system, and that's when they started the process to choose a global enterprise labeling system. This is a really great current, torn from today's headlines example. It mirrors my personal experience from 2007 to 2009, but it is present day and proves that regardless of the system you choose, the runway to get into the choice of which system to buy is long. It is about understanding what you need and gaining consensus amongst a very large group of very engaged stakeholders. Since it takes so long to get to the choosing stage of the GLS, you should start as soon as you know which pain points the global labeling system will address. Both you and your sponsor will appreciate this holistic approach. You have to. Or you got the wrong sponsor. Your sponsor has to be in it for the long haul, or the project may fade before you get to the global label system step. If your company engages in active change management, you're fortunate. And by change management, I mean where your company actively addresses the cultural resistance to change that is ever present and ubiquitous when you go to change a system that touches so many stakeholders in so many places. If your company doesn't have a built-in process, it will be incumbent on you to build an army of change agents to see the project to completion. Your sponsor is your first step. Your sponsor could fire up your change management folks, or if that's not an option, your sponsor can convene an executive steering committee to keep the project on track for the duration of the project. I don't want to overplay this. Buying an expensive enterprise system that's going to make everyone change how they do things is not an easy sell. Your steering committee should contain the VP of the department who's paying for the system, as well as the heads of RA, QA, operations, IT, and supply chain. These are the groups that are directly tied to the process. You'll need input from all these groups to agree upon your global labeling system. Having the head of each department on your steering committee will ensure you get their attention. So why spend this much time on a process instead of the system requirements? Because each one of these groups will inform your global labeling system decision. No one's going to put out $1 million for a GLS if they don't see the value in the GLS. And that's why the pain points from your assessment are so important. These pain points need to be talked about, understood, and quantified. Again, they are the reason to invest this time, energy, and money to getting a global labeling system. So you're thinking, I was hoping for a shopping list, and this webinar is more about putting in the work. Don't log off just yet. I've got something like a shopping list for you. You'll just have to sit through a little validation talk. So do you really need to validate your system? I mean, you verify all your labels. And what does software validation look like? Do the systems come pre-validated? Let's go to 21 CFR 820, Quality System Regulations for Automated Processes. When computers or automated data processing systems are used as part of production or the quality system, the manufacturer shall validate computer software for its intended use according to established protocol. All software changes shall be validated before approval and issuance. So you need to validate your labeling system. The FDA guidelines for software validation are clear, bold, but clear. FDA suggests validating software per the V model. The V model starts with a user requirement specification. There is then a functional specification showing how the software meets the URS, which in turn is governed by a design specification that demonstrates that the software was developed to meet the requirements of medical device labeling. The solution provider will conduct the IQ against the design specification and the OQ against the functional specification. You, the user, will perform the PQ with your label data using your operating system, like Windows 10, and your web browser, like Google Chrome or Internet Explorer. The solution provider will provide all the IQ and OQ documentation and likely will help with the PQ protocol. So essentially, you're involved in the validation at the beginning and end of the V model. You write the user requirement specification and perform the PQ. I know I said we'd get to the user requirement specification after validation, but we're going to get there by going through a DFEMA first. Gather the nerds, dust off your DFMEA form. You may have another preset agenda. Your project management office may have a method for creating a risk matrix, but if you don't have any other company guidelines, start with understanding the hazards associated with med device labeling. What are the hazards of designing and printing med device labels? You could print an unapproved label. Someone may unintentionally change label data. There could be an incorrect barcode symbology on the label. Required information might be missing. Incorrect version of a label may print. Printers may get conflicting label requests. The web browser may be incompatible with the system. The incorrect print driver may garble data. Barcode formats may not be supported. The cause of these could be that the software code was not operating as expected. The system's configuration may result in mangled communications to printers. The system is not operating as expected with regards to versioning rules. User rights are incorrectly assigned. When you identify some of these failures and their causes, and you can identify them as being mitigated by having a validated labeling system, you have just created automatic requirements for your user requirement specification. Go ahead and step through this process before you start creating your user requirement spec. Your most critical user requirements will come from this exercise. Okay, creating the user requirement specification, referred to hereafter as the URS. You may have another preset agenda, or your project management office may have a template. Use that. If you don't, let's just start with the basics. You can slice your URS up in any way you want, but basically your requirements are going to be grouped under the following topics: system integration, user account administration, data management, design tools, workflow, and printing capabilities. It doesn't matter if you get a requirement under the wrong topic, no harm done. The important thing is to identify the requirement. Let's begin. System integration. You will need a labeling system to integrate with your ERP or your PLM or your MES system in order to pull variable lot-based data. You'll need to interface with the system that holds the lot number, the quantity, the shelf life data to calculate an expiration date, and you might need to pull serial numbers and you might need to pull G10s. Each company's data is structured differently, so your IT group will need to understand and describe the interface between the global labeling system and your existing systems. You know you'll need to get information out of the current system. You may want to have the GLS provide information to other systems. You may have an EDHF, an EDMR, or an EDHR that you want the GLS to send information to. Consider if you want to have the labeling system feeding in any information to an existing system. Some global labeling systems can communicate with change control systems, so you might want to look into that. Which begs the question, are you ready to sit down with your stakeholders and specify a global labeling system? Do you understand the state of the industry well enough to fix a plate at the GLS cafeteria? Your IT guys are going to want particulars, and you likely won't have them. So you should consider an RFI, a request for information. Ring your colleagues in other companies and Google med device labeling systems and ask a couple for an RFI. Limit the number of solution providers and keep their time limited. Then let them show off what they've got. These RFIs are most important for you and your IT groups to understand the options for integration. Global labeling systems are all designed to accomplish the same goals, so the RA, ops, and supply chain requirements are well covered. Getting the GLS integrated with your system is always the biggest open question. Your IT group will have the most questions as their touch points will have the most nerve endings. And remember, building your URS is more often than not an iterative process. You will likely not get it right on your first try. Aside from the requirements from your DFEMA, these specifications are not really requirements, but nice to haves that best line up with your business. User account administration. This area is where you transfer a lot of your causes of failures from your DFEMA. Go look at your DFEMA and start looking at where the user rights incorrectly assigned is shown as the cause and bring those user rights into the URS. This is where you'll be transporting a lot of your risk mitigation activities. Solution must provide the ability for system administration to define user accounts, roles, and privileges. Privileged user must have rights to configure an algorithm to calculate an expiry date. Other responsibilities become clear as you identify certain roles within the process. For designers, a privileged user must have rights to import data. Privileged user must have rights to configure an existing table. Privileged user must have rights to print a label while in design state. Privileged user must have rights to print a label while in pending state. Privileged user must have rights to promote a record to approved. Privileged user must have rights to approve all records returned by a filter to approved. For production printing, the privileged user must have rights to print production labels. For regulatory affairs associates, privileged user must have right to view read-only labels. Both your IT and your QA group will be very interested in this section. IT has a real good handle on user roles and rights as they likely serve as system administrators for your other corporate systems, and QA, who is going to recognize where the lines between the roles should be. Different companies go to different links on their URS. Some might list every possible right a user might have and then confirm each in the PQ. Others may list things in general with some examples for clarity. I will say this, if you're on the fence on how detailed to make this URS, I suggest going toward more detail for two reasons. First, if a use case shows up that you hadn't anticipated, but it turns out that the system has the capability to address it, your quality group may require a revalidation to keep the system in a validated state. That will mean a revision to the URS, regression testing, and then an amendment to the PQ protocol. It will turn out to be more trouble to do it later than it would to do it up front. And secondly, your assumption that the solution providers will understand that when you ask for A, C, and E, you obviously meant B and D, but when the solution provider suggests that this may require several thousands of dollars worth of custom configuration, it just becomes a source of dissatisfaction. Data management. This section is where your labeling group, IT, and QA groups will want to sink their teeth into. When we talked about pain points that would be addressed by the global labeling system, these are the groups that are feeling those points. Pain point. It takes forever to make the same change to every single label. User requirement. System must have ability to make mass changes. Pain point. Managing country-specific labeling with bills of material is very time and resource intensive and has resulted in CAPAs. User requirement. System must have ability to create and maintain custom data sets. Pain point. Scoping label changes takes forever and are always wrong. User requirement. Ability to where used reports against label data. Pain point. Approving label changes is so onerous that after a label is created or revised, it sometimes takes 2 months to get them approved. User requirement. System must have electronic side-by-side compare features that highlight every difference between versions for easy review of label changes. The best thing about a global labeling system, and this is my opinion, is the ability to take approved label content and manage it in a way that meets the needs of the company, meets the needs of regulatory affairs, meets the need of the healthcare providers, meets the needs of the different markets. It's like putting an escalator on a mountain. Let's go back to the Russian labeling requirements. This happened just a year after we all scrambled to meet the Turkish requirements. They wanted product descriptions and IFUs in the Russian language, not too different than the EU requirements, but they also needed a date of registration for the product, for the specific product, and a Russian quality seal on each label. How do you manage something like that if you don't have total control of the data for each product? When this storm rolled in, our only concern was getting translations in time. Our global labeling system was up and running, and meeting this requirement was as easy as breathing. Our graphic artist replicated the quality symbol. We added that symbol to our symbol library in our system. Ari scoped out the project, providing us with registration dates. It took us less than an hour to link these dates and the quality symbol to item numbers. Our European distribution center was applying country-specific labeling and shipping compliant product to Russia 2 months before the deadline. I know other companies that had to bail on Russia because they couldn't figure out how to meet the labeling requirement, and we did it without breaking a sweat. I was at a client's offsite to reimagine their labeling process. The VP came in and set expectations. He told the group that he expected that the labeling process should be able to create an approved label in a day, reduce field actions to 0, and increase labeling capacity by 15%. The assembled group was dumbstruck. At their best, the fastest time to create an approved label was 7 weeks. They had had 4 field actions the year before, and after a complete overhaul of their labeling department, they were capable of revising 100 labels a week. To them, the VP's challenge was absurd, but the VP had come from a company that had a functioning GLS, and he knew better. Design tools. Your labeling group gets to lean in on this one. They'll want to have text boxes that resize font as it exceeds the available space. They'll want to be able to set a minimum font size, and they'll want the design tool to alert them and not allow the label if that space is exceeded at the minimum font. They'll want image libraries. They'll want the system to be able to handle any font in all languages. They'll want the system to recognize and handle right to left text. They'll want a bunch of things to help them create sharp, easy to understand templates. The nice thing is that most global labeling systems have very good design tools, so this one should be pretty straightforward. Workflow. You have to have some workflow in your labeling system, because even if you approve all new and revised labels in your change control system, you'll still need to move your labels to an approved state within the system. This is probably the right section to add the requirements for electronic signatures and audit logs. So just call out that the system needs to be Part 11 compliant. This also dictates that you have versioning in your global labeling system. Your labeling people, your QA people, and your doc control people should get together on this. This is really important. You should be able to build out various types of workflow in your label system. You may want to consider allowing mass updates like address changes, logo tweaks to be controlled within your labeling system while all others are done in your change control system. Some systems have workflow that can talk to other change control systems, allowing you to do all the change control within the labeling system while still having those changes available through change control system. With everything being approved, version controlled, and recorded in an audit log, your labeling system serves as a validated document repository. For companies that use engineering drawings to control label content, you can leverage your GLS to eliminate these drawings. You'll still need label stock specifications, but for the purpose of specifying what the label looks like, the latest approved version of any label is the label specification. That's a time saver. This is a real game changer for companies that use bills of material to control label content because of the second aspect of this change. If the system holds the label specification, you won't have to put the specific label ID on the bill of material. You'll only have to put the label stock on the bill of material. I mentioned it briefly in the data management section, but I'll go into a little more detail here. You can have multiple labels associated with an item number. You create and identify the primary label, the label that goes on your folding cart when you pack it out, by coding it in the system as a primary label. And you configure all the printers on your packaging lines to be configured to print primary labels. You can create and identify another label from the data associated with the same item number and code it as, let's say, a country-specific label. You have another workstation or workstations in your distribution center that you configure to print country-specific labels. Then you configure the system to require a country to be called out before it prints a country-specific label. All these configurations are in the system and invisible to the operator. Now, you don't have to have a particular label ID on your bill of material to call out the country-specific label for China. You just scan the product to get the item number, you scan the pick list to identify the product as destined for China, and the label printer prints out the China-specific label. You can even make the system confirm the label by scanning the barcodes on the country-specific label before it can print another label. Built-in line clearance. Bam! In the last 2 minutes, you just got rid of discrete engineering drawings for your labels and having to put those drawing numbers on bills of material to make sure the right label got on the right product. I know that right now there are people attending this webinar that are saying to themselves, because we're social distancing, otherwise they'd be looking at their coworker and saying it to them. They're saying, oh my goodness, that's exactly what we do. And we average a capper every year for mix-ups. This alone would justify a global labeling system. Oh my God, can we get a copy of this webinar? Yeah, you can we'll send you a copy of the webinar after this, afterwards. And if you've got a friend that wants it, just have them come to our website. Printing capabilities. This category is like a design control section. Most global labeling systems have the drivers to print to most commercial printers. Just make sure you do a printer check at all your sites so you don't get surprised. Don't forget to check with your contract manufacturers in your distribution centers. You want to make sure that your system allows for your contract manufacturers and distribution centers can come into the system to print labels that you've created and approved. Who amongst us hasn't spent a couple weeks teaching a contract manufacturer how to make a UDI barcode only to find out months later that they copied and used the same barcode on the last 4 lots of material they sent in? That's always fun. Okay, you can create and approve a label in 1 day. You can update and approve 1,000 labels in 1 day. You can drive field actions due to labeling down to 0. You can be able to respond immediately to country-specific labeling requirements. You can stop controlling your labeling content with bills of material. You can make your label approval process a breeze with this compare feature. You can control your contract manufacturers by allowing them to print labels that you create and approve. And you can eliminate pre-printing IFUs for low-volume markets by printing single language IFUs at the time of final shipping. You're ready to start. Identify your required labeling elements, define your roles and responsibility, and simplify your label development and production printing procedure over the course of this process. A broken process in front of a brand new GLS is going to make your GLS look bad. Get a sponsor, get some advocates, and get started.
All right. Thank you, Chris Hecker, for quote unquote gathering the nerds for your wonderful presentation over how to choose a global labeling system. So currently there are no questions. So if anybody has any questions, please migrate over to the chat feature and insert them there. Before we get into that though, Network Partners has one more webinar in our Labeling Brunch and Learn series, and that is what a global labeling system implementation really looks like, again with our Senior Director of Labeling, Chris Hecker, and that'll be on August 6th. You can register. It is a free webinar. You can register on our site, networkpartners.com, under resources and then events. So Chris, it looks like you have no questions. So I'm going to go ahead and give it maybe 10 more seconds, and then I will finish the conclusion, and I will send out the recorded link to all the registrants afterwards. So thank you everyone for your participation today, and to our speaker again, Chris Hecker. If you have any labeling questions or you need help, you can always reach out to a Network Partners team member, and we can ensure that it gets to the appropriate contact. Again, you'll receive this recorded presentation and a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation. Be sure to stay in the loop and follow Network Partners on LinkedIn to access our updates and future webinars. Thank you again, and everyone have a great rest of your Thursday.